Well, welcome back, everybody, to Planning Complex Native Plant Communities by Sandor Alfred Purvis, that would be me, and of A Cultivated Art, Inc. And that is the website I'll mention a few times through the talk is acultivatedart.com. And I'm mentioning that because I went and made a plant library on there of native species, and I just wanted I want it to be a resource for people who are working with native plants, because I know it can be a bit challenging sometimes to find what you need to find out to be able to actually care for complex plant community or plan one out. So there are a lot of facets to why urban and suburban gardens look the way that they do today, and history around how native plants are perceived and talked about. Garden designs, both how they are formatted and presented, and the gardens that are created by following them, also have a lot of things baked into them that are not always immediately apparent. I've been unpacking and thinking about these things for a while, and I've come to appreciate the importance of looking at where we came from and how we've gotten here when it comes to choosing where to go next and how to get there. With that in mind, I am going to start this talk off with a walk through my history with gardens, landscapes, plants in the horticultural world. I'll spend some time describing some things I've learned along the way, and sorry, I keep having pop-ups. With that in mind, I'm going to start this talk off with a walk through my history with gardens, landscapes, plants in the horticultural world. I'll spend some time describing some things I've learned along the way that have heavily influenced why I do what I do now, from planting so many seeds to drawing planting plans that are just that, plans for planting day, rather than the splashy 3D renderings that were once the centerpiece of my design services. Once the whys have been explored, I'll walk you through the relatively straightforward steps that make up the what of planning out a native plant community for the space you care for, along with some resources for finding out more about native plant species for your region. This presentation portion, as I said, will run between 50 and 60 minutes, and we will finish up with a Q&A. So where it began. So my journey into the gardening world started early. As we often do with children, we planted seeds one spring. And watching the transformation of something I was able to hold in the palm of my then much smaller hand into a gigantic squash vine that was just the best magic ever. I was also impressed with the squash themselves. Not enough to want to actually eat them, but definitely impressed. Once I encountered it, I had to learn all that I could about this thing called gardening. Over time, I checked out every single gardening book in the Picton Public Library, many of them multiple times. I learned about all the different plants in those books. I wasn't interested in the Sears Wish book. I poured over the Rockwood Garden Flyers and the Stoke Seedle catalog and made my wish list from those instead. My career followed a path through garden centers and greenhouses into garden and landscape design. I received awards for my work and was heavily involved in the professional horticultural and landscaping world. But over the years, more and more of that world was being taken over by concrete and stone. Gardens were becoming less about gardening and more about low maintenance curb appeal for looking at rather than caring for or having a relationship with. Somewhere along the way, something had gone wrong. This was not the joy and wonder that had sparked my love of gardening. Even my joy in plants was becoming tarnished by my increasing awareness of how much greenhouse plastic, natural gas heating, peat moss, irrigation, fertilizers, insecticides, plastic containers and tags, and shipping was associated with growing those instant gratification, impulse purchasable retail-ready plants. I was looking for something else. I just didn't know what it was. I finally found the seeds of it in a book, one that, despite being all about plants, was not shelved in the garden section of the bookstore, but in the indigenous section. Plants have so much to give us. All we have to do is ask. Anishinaabe Botanical Teachings by Mary Sisubgenis, a book filled with practical scientific details alongside and on equal footing with teaching stories of plants as living beings with gifts and abilities that they share with us. A book written from the perspective of a human within nature, rather than viewing nature as a system separate from the human one, of being in relationship with rather than exerting control over the lives and ecosystems that surround us and to make our lives possible. She described it, the type of connection I'd been looking for in gardening. I had followed the path into horticulture that had been drawn by the industry, trends, and marketing. I hadn't followed the plants. The plants hadn't forgotten how to be in relationship. I had, my ancestors had, my culture had. Horticulture, as we are taught it, is rarely about the plants and their communities and relationships. It's about the showiest, the biggest, the rarest, the most, the best behaved. It's about treating the plants as a material for our artistic and aesthetic expression, of tidying, manicuring, and maintaining our creations in the state we have decided is the most desirable, with little, if any, understanding or centering of the relationships of those plants. This is what happens when business, competition, and colonization are allowed to shape our relationships. To paraphrase David Graeber, to make something saleable in a living economy, one first needs to rip it from its context. There isn't a lot of profit to be made in selling plants if the local and abundant are as or even more valuable than the exotic or rare. If gardening was allowed to be about the local network of plants and all the life they support, gardeners might just go out and gather seeds from asters and goldenrods and fill the gardens with free plants. Much better business to
use the white onion.
Much better business to move them to other places, to sell patented cultivars of North American species in Europe and European species in North America, where they need to be sourced from licensed growers rather than seed libraries. The role of gardener, if we allow it to be defined by the horticultural industry, is not one of being a guardian or a steward of the land. But we don't have to let the industry define the narrative. We can look to the plants and their relationships for a different story. We can seek out the Indigenous teachers who tell the stories of being in relationship with a complex network of life that sustains us. We can look for ways to offer care and support in return for all we receive. Humans have always been keystone species in this ecosystem, have always carried and cared for seeds and tended the spaces those seeds are brought to. There is a lot that those of us from newly arrived cultures can learn from the people who guided the growth and abundance of this place since the retreat of the glaciers. But it isn't about going back to something that once was. Backwards is impossible. From the soil biology to water cycles to the climate, the changes of the last 2.5 centuries can't simply be erased or ignored. The process of healing begins with what exists now and asks, how can we contribute to the cultivation of a thriving network of life going forward? Starting can be as simple as inviting the displaced species back to the land in our care and holding space for that joyful disorder and complex relationships and life cycles that they bring with them. Healing continues when we cultivate curiosity about their lives. Who are you? How do you live? What are your relationships? By following their stories, we can begin to relearn how to participate in complex networks of relationships without trying to simplify or escape them. We can also practice acting as guardians and stewards of the land by pouring our energy into reshaping our own communities to fit the plant communities of this place, instead of shaping the plant communities to suit the human society currently occupying it. Plants are generous. If we let them, they will help us reconnect with the joy of chaotic, resilient abundance, of being fully interconnected with the lives that surround and support our own. Nearly 4 decades after planting that first squash seed, after following the path into the garden world as it had been shaped by the industry, I've retraced my steps, returning to the seeds that originally introduced me to the world of plants. I've come back to the place that they first showed me all those years ago, and despite my getting sidetracked for a while, it's still the best magic ever. And I've learned a lot from those seeds and the plants that they've become over the last few years. I've learned about abundance as they feed and shelter so many of the species that surround them, species that have now begun to make their homes in spaces that I helped to tend. I've learned about generosity as they offer so very many seeds that they fill all the spaces I care for, all the trays of seedlings that I can grow for spring sales, and as many seeds as I can clean and pass on to the also generous volunteers at the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library and the North American Native Plant Seed Exchange. I've learned about diversity, adaptability, and specialization as some species happily occupy whatever space is available, while others thrive in what seems like incredibly challenging conditions, but struggle in an enriched garden setting. I've learned to pay more attention to the life cycle adaptations, the glorious rudbeckias that grow fast, seed abundantly, and die young, and the black snake root that slowly matures into stately elegance over several years and becomes a long-term member of the plant community. I've also learned more about how annuals help injured ecosystems heal by quickly filling in after disturbance and then dropping their seeds to the soil to be ready to patch up any future gouges in the fabric of the perennial ecosystem, and how annuals can help assist in transitioning from one perennial ecosystem to another. Weeds, those plants we call weeds, do a lot of important things. I've learned about how some species specialize in filling a particular layer in a perennial ecosystem, with some low-growing, early-blooming species specifically adapted to growing between and below taller, later-blooming species, and making the most of both the early spring sunlight and moisture, while also being protected from scorching summer sunlight and heat. These living mulch species are actually far too often missing from our gardens. I've learned that a lot of native species that can otherwise thrive in urban settings have evolved in community with other plants. And when they're taken away from those relationships, they can start to behave in unexpected ways, including growing too tall and flopping over, overwhelming neighboring plants by spreading too quickly and or seeding at a very fast rate, or by becoming vulnerable to a range of pests or diseases in ways that they rarely do outside of cultivated gardens. I've learned that a lot of traits that are often judged as problematic are simply a symptom of being out of place, or more often and less discussed, lacking the appropriate community. I've learned about the value of competition and cooperation from the species that evolved in high resource areas with plenty of neighbors, that root competition from surrounding grasses will keep some flowers from growing too tall, so tall that they blow over on a windy day, and that a lot of species rely on the shelter and physical support of grasses and other neighbors to remain upright once they become top-heavy with blooms. I've learned that some species that are perfectly happy growing in sand, gravel, deep shade, or other low resource areas often have little, if any, capacity to compete with neighbors for resources in richer areas, and actually can very quickly become overwhelmed if they are planted near more rambunctious neighbors. So they specialize, they grow with very few resources, but they can't compete when there's actually more resources available. I've also learned just how much life is lived in that dense mass of grasses and other plants between and below the showy flowers that are so often the only ones that are considered for inclusion in the gardens. Conventional gardens are so often filled with unnoticed empty spaces. Plant communities are not. If you are regularly removing annual weeds from a mature perennial garden or relying on reapplication of mulch to suppress volunteer seedlings, that's a good indication that there are unfilled roles in that garden community. With these lessons in mind, I've looked back at patterns embedded into a lot of what I learned to do in conventional garden design. I've noticed quite a few things from my new perspective. I've noticed that a lot of horticultural practices are about standardizing conditions as much as possible to accommodate a standardized list of species and cultivars to perform in predictable ways and will require predictable inputs and standardized care. I've noticed that a lot of plant production is about selecting the prettiest and most compliant species and cultivars from each area of the world, cloning them and planting them into gardens in any compatible climate. I've noticed that this has contributed not only to the loss of local and regional diversity, but also to the loss of diversity between regions. Gardens pictures from Poland, which this one is, look an awful lot like garden pictures from Ottawa or Calgary or Vancouver or London, England, etc. All very photogenic, but lacking in relationship to place. They don't reflect their local ecosystems. And I really noticed that one day when this picture popped up as a recommended group in a recommended group on Facebook. And I just went to scroll by until I noticed that the caption said it was in Poland. And I looked at it and went, but I know every plant in that picture. I could buy every plant in that picture here in Ottawa. So that was a bit of a moment of going, wait a second, we're planting the same short list of species everywhere, not just all over this community or in this country. We're planting them all, the same ones on other continents. And I've drawn a lot of landscape and planting plans over the course of my design career. I started with black and white line drawings, moved on to colored presentation plans, and finally to 3D model landscapes. And I got pretty good at making pretty spaces that awed clients and sold projects. But I've noticed some things about those pretty plans. The aesthetic tidiness of design drawings or planting plans has become so embedded into what is considered good design that it has contributed, possibly been one of the top contributors to the shift to the ecologically oversimplified landscapes that have become so ubiquitous over the last few decades. Not only do they look tidy on the plan, large clusters of single species or cultivars are also faster to draw and label, and they require less horticultural knowledge on the part of whoever is planting or maintaining the resulting landscape. I've also noticed that plans and renderings tend to misrepresent plant communities in multiple ways, showing both an entire season of blooms compressed into a single image and a single point in the life of a plant community with no allowance for transitions between early and late succession species and how the community will change and mature over the years. And the efforts to restrict that natural progression are so embedded into horticulture that we rarely pause to consider what the word maintenance means to a living system. Systems which are never meant to exist in stasis, and how common maintenance practices run in direct opposition to healthy growth and maturing, often to the detriment and eventual decline of the plant spaces, resulting in the eventual removal or extensive renovations of whole gardens and landscapes. And I've also learned that I don't want to help convince people that native plants can fit into conventional gardens without changing practices or expectations, because those practices and expectations, which in a lot of ways extend far past the garden gate, are a large part of what have led to the biodiversity loss that the native plant movement is trying to push back against. I don't want to risk simply switching from monocultures or near monocultures of Eurasian species for equivalently simplified and endlessly replicated swaths of an equally narrow range of native species, restricted only to the ones that conform to a limiting cultural aesthetic and conventional landscape maintenance practices. And Echinacea and Rudbeckia species are actually already being squeezed into that role through no fault of their own, beyond their capacity to tolerate the things we expect to be able to do to plants, including separating them from their communities. So instead, I'm putting my energy into making alternative approaches and a longer list of native species more available and accessible. This started with getting to know and finding seed sources for a lot more native species than are usually on offer in local garden centers, but it also meant a change to how I go about designing a planting plan and in how I present them. While Bubbled together clusters of a single species or rendered images of gardens full of blooming plants are styles that present well and that most people have come to expect. They directly contribute to the oversimplification of plant communities. Also, pretty renderings reinforce the idea that the first job of the plants is to look pretty within a particular cultural aesthetic. And I don't want to contribute to that narrative anymore. Another well-intended but ultimately counterproductive narrative is that native plants are easy. This one doesn't work because when many of them are placed into conventional gardens or simply neglected spaces, which is something people often end up doing with native plants, they either fail to thrive or they thrive to such an extent that they become overwhelming. In urban settings, hydrangeas, hostas, and burning bushes will win on the basis of staying tidy with very little care. When we allow or even promote easy as the deciding factor in which species are allowed space, we eventually end up back at a short list of compliant species being planted in garden after garden. A lot of that perception that native plant gardens are messy originates from overpromising of how low maintenance wildflower gardens are. Removing your gammon and tossing down a mix of seeds isn't an effective way to start a complex plant community, no matter what those shakers of wildflower seeds say. Mind you, most of those aren't filled with native species, but that's how they're often perceived, and then how native species are judged, sometimes by gardens full of non-native species. And planting and ignoring a bed of native seedlings selected based on their pretty color combinations is only slightly more successful than that shaker of seeds. The low maintenance part of the equation comes with time as the ecosystem matures and from careful attention to the conditions, the needs of the plants, and the community of species that they come from. The time investment is upfront, and if it's skipped, poor outcomes result more often than not. Overselling with claims of easy and low maintenance is a bit like catfishing gardeners. It might occasionally lead to a good relationship, but more often it ends in disappointment, frustration, and breakup. On the other hand, the story of how important native plants are to pollinators, birds, and the ecosystem as a whole has converted and retained far more garden and lawn space and passionate advocates than the low maintenance narrative ever has. So, based on the things I've learned over the last few years, here's some things that I hope will help some of the new ecologically concerned native plant gardeners plan complex plant communities that have a good chance not just surviving, but of thriving and supporting like local pollinators, caterpillars, birds, and many other layers of the ecosystem, and which only happen to end up being lovely and low maintenance in the long run. So, making your plan. Do take a look at where you are. What is your regional and ecozone history? And for example, what is now urban and rural Ottawa was once primarily forests, shorelines, and wetlands, as well as a few areas of shallow soil that limited tree cover, and that allowed for some areas of meadows or alvars. But with nearly a meter of water falling from the sky each year in this region, and the historical burn cycle here is really quite limited, averaging at around 500 years or more, rather than the 100-year average of the boreal forest, and the much higher burn frequency of the prairie ecosystems in oak savannas common further to the west. But since colonization, which has altered the ecosystem through the attempted removal of the people who manage and protect those ecosystems, and the wholesale cutting of mature forests, along with the ongoing disruption cycles of things like annual agriculture and the mowing of lawns, the range of meadow ecosystems and the species that make them up have actually been moving to the north and east. They've been coming in this direction. And this migration of ecosystem is also being driven by the change in global climate. Something that can be seen in the updates to the Canadian growing zone map, which shows Ottawa, which is the little red dot there, has shifted from zone 4A to 5B, over the last several decades. The official municipal report on expected increase in the length of summer and the number of over 30 Celsius days each year for the city of Ottawa puts us in roughly zone 7 or 8 in less than 30 years. And that's a degree of summer heat stress that not all regionally native species are going to be able to tolerate. There has been a lot of changes and there's more to come. Not only are the forests that existed around Ottawa today early to mid-succession rather than mature ecosystems, the ecosystem types that are most often found in urban spaces are closer to what would be found in open woodland, in dry meadows, at the base of cliffs, and in other spaces where we direct the rain that runs off the roofs and off of paved surfaces. We have novel ecosystems that have aspects of both wetland and very dry meadow conditions. In many urban and suburban spaces, soil is compacted and lacking a protective layer of coarse, mixed, decomposing organic matter. On the other hand, garden beds are often heavily enriched with organic matter like bark mulch from forest, manures from agriculture, or black earth from peat bogs, creating a concentration of organic matter far beyond what would be typical of growing conditions for many of the native prairie or meadow species that otherwise adapt well to sunny urban spaces. Earthworms introduced from European ecosystems at the same time as European agriculture practices were introduced have increased the rate of cycling of organic matter, reducing the duff layer in forests and stressing many of the ephemeral and understory species and seedlings, and have created the type of disruption cycles where other species like garlic mustard can thrive. All of these things mean that there will be some trial and error as we work with plants to find out which will thrive in these new conditions. Moving from sort of the general regional considerations to the specifics, what can you find out about the piece of land you are working with? To start drawing up a base plan for your planting plan, do take some overall measurements of the area you'll be working with and plot out the space on some graph paper. I'm not including the step-by-step instructions for this stage, since you will actually find there's lots of videos and articles online on how to take measurements and draw up a base plan for a garden or landscape. If you do happen to have a favorite one that you'd like to share with everyone else here, please go ahead and drop that link in the chat. But when you go to do when you're drawing your base plan, you're following the steps of whichever tutorial appealed to you. In addition to existing structures, trees, shrubs, paths, patios, etc., do note the things like the spread of tree roots, which is usually roughly twice the spread of the branches. These areas will tend to have lower moisture in typical summer conditions, but will actually sometimes have higher moisture availability during drought conditions as trees pull up water from deeper in the soil. Areas of compacted soil are also worth noting, and that includes most existing lawns. They're usually at least somewhat compacted even if you do aerate, but also any areas that have had limited plant cover for any extended period of time, regular foot traffic, or have had anything piled or stacked on them for extended periods. Any areas of already enriched soils, so a lot of gardens have a history of additions of compost, manure, mulch, or other organic matter or organic amendments. These areas may actually be too rich for some species, but are really good fit for others. Any very low nutrient, gravelly or sandy areas are also worth noting. These are common in strips between like neighboring driveways where you've got a few feet between two driveways. Very often it was graveled all the way across, especially in subdivisions that were all built at the same time. And then they just dumped a bit of soil on top. That can be a dry spot that might suit dry meadow species. But you also, anywhere where you've had recent excavation, you're probably also dealing with some low nutrient or subsoil. And again, some species thrive in low nutrient, well-drained soils and others struggle. It isn't necessarily something to fix, just to observe and keep in mind when you're selecting species for the space. Also note any areas that are frequently physically disturbed by activities like snow clearing and areas that are exposed to salt damage each year. These might be good spots for some annual species because, again, annuals have a strong relationship with disturbance cycles. And if something's killing off the perennial species, annuals are very often happy to come back and fill in those gaps. And there are some native annuals to this area. So when it comes to existing conditions, some things can change and some things are more permanent. When it comes to soil, you can help to build organic matter, reduce compaction, and you can feed the soil biology by leaving the leaves or adding wood chips or other bulk organic matter if the soil has been recently disturbed or is otherwise stressed. What you can't effectively change without hauling away the existing soil and hauling in soil extracted from some other ecosystem is the mineral makeup. But the soil on the left and the soil on the right in this picture are the same sand, silt, mineral soil. And that's still what makes up the bulk of it. But what has changed is the amount of biological activity and the amount of organic matter, both of which have risen as I've added wood chips, rotting hay, miscellaneous other plant bits over the years. Although the plants and the soil life did most of the work of converting that one soil to the other. And I've been actively working on building up the biology and the organic matter in the soil because this is actually my vegetable garden, and annuals tend to like high nutrient soils. Perennials, a lot of them can get by with lower nutrient soils. Also on the topic of soil, I've met a lot of gardeners over the years who have the impression that they're working with clay when what they're really working with is compacted soils that lack a healthy organic layer. A jar test will give you a definitive answer about this at no cost. And even if you don't have clay soil, and even if you do have clay soil, it's not that big a deal. Stay off of it when it's wet to keep it from gluing together into bricks. Keep it covered with an organic layer and fill it with plants. Perennial species do just fine in clay soils that aren't being compacted through digging, tilling, or foot traffic. And if compaction is the real culprit, you can address that with a garden fork by breaking up the ground or by working with the soil biology and plants with a good layer of leaves, arborist wood chips, and a season of fast-growing annuals. And if you'd like to learn more about sort of no-till planting bed prep that works with the existing soil rather than changing your soil out, check out the ecological garden making video that you can find in the video library on my website. That goes through everything step by step. And for that jar test, the email that you got a couple of hours ago reminding you about this with the list of links in it, the jar test is one of the links that I provided. The next factor to consider is how much sunlight is available for the space. And how much does it fluctuate through the season? So my backyard is on the north side of my house, and there's a large tree at the back, at the north side of the yard. So in spring, and right now, the sun shines right back to the back fence, angling under the tree canopy, even after the leaves begin to break. But the house actually shades part of the yard closer, shades the south half of the yard, basically, because it's on the north side of the house. But at the start of summer, the sun shines right down into the area close to the house because it's at such a high angle, while the garden at the back of the fence is in quite a bit of shade from the tree canopy. And then as fall rolls around, the sun angle shifts, puts the middle of the yard back into shade and the back fence into the sun. So if you're planning for forest-adapted spring ephemerals like bloodroot and trillium, you can plan based on how much sun the area you're working with gets in May. And for meadow species and prairie species, consider the July and August sun patterns. So it's not just sun, it's what time of year of the sun. And a bit more changeable than soil and sunlight is the question of water. Now, first of all, can you water during the establishment phase? And if not, you might want to consider a fall planting rather than a spring one, or planting annuals into the space in the spring, because it's not that big a deal if they don't thrive over the summer, and then put the perennials in the fall when they're going to have 2 wet seasons before the first hot season to establish. Also, the question of how much water is available to the future plant community. Will they strictly rely on rainfall, or can you supplement during dry spells? Can you collect some of the water that is shed off of roofs during rainstorms and dole that out between the storms? Can you direct downspouts into the garden so that it can soak up all the water rather than letting it run away over compacted turf or paving? So can you hold on to more of the water from each rain event? Are there areas that are consistently wet in the spring and or the fall that can be high moist, that can host high moisture loving species like swamp rose mallow, that's native hibiscus with those huge flowers, swamp milkweed, boneset, etc. So the moisture loving species that can adapt to average garden conditions, average sort of moderately dry soils, but really thrive if they've got extra moisture. And then if you layer the sunlight and moisture info on top of each other on your whatever your base plan is, along with any particular soil notes that you've made, you end up with a map of conditions that you can use to start to narrow down the best fit ecosystem to look to for inspiration when selecting plants. Dry meadow species tend to prefer very sunny areas with at least 6 hours of direct sun, preferably from noon onward. A lot of meadow species and most open woodland species will get along all right with 4 hours of direct sun and a certain amount of dappled shade. And if you have dappled shade all day or only an hour or two of sun at one end of the day or the other, your go-to plants will be species adapted to a forest ecosystem. Existing enriched garden beds in full or partial sun are also often a good fit for species that evolved in high moisture meadows, which tend to also have high nutrient soils. You can find this list that's on the screen right now. You can find this list of ecosystem types and how they relate to conditions common in urban and suburban spaces on the Using the Plant Library page on my website. And each of those headings, if you click on it, will take you to a list of the species that are specific to that ecosystem description. And they're Ontario native species unless specifically clearly labeled otherwise, because almost everything on that website is Ontario native. So in my backyard, the areas that can correspond to different ecosystem types would look something like this. So with some dry meadow, some meadow, and some woodland areas. And so before diving into the actual planting layout, do spend some time planning for practical considerations in the space. Space for moving through and spending time in the ecosystem that you're helping to nurture for activities like gathering seeds and removing seedlings when appropriate, especially ones of invasive species or tree seedlings if the space isn't appropriate for a forest. Because while you may be making a wonderful, healthy native ecosystem in the space you're working with, you still likely have neighboring lands where invasive species seeds can come from. So you will have to still tend the space. Note where you will need to maintain safe sight lines, especially where pedestrians and vehicles intersect, which generally means sticking with a species to species with heights under 2 feet. And so that will tend to be near driveways. If you're lucky enough to be in an area that permits boulevard planting, which hopefully will include Ottawa within the next year, there's height restrictions in those spaces for perfectly valid safety reasons. And they need to be respected. And so plants convert sunlight to calories. So if you plan to grow some of your food close to home, which can actually be a hugely helpful thing to ecosystems if you're thinking sort of on a more global scale, consider allocating a portion of any of the sunny areas to edible species. And can you include a space for things like kitchen scrap composting so that you can be returning more nutrients to the soil? A tumbling compost can be a good option if you're concerned about small mammals moving in and causing issues in the spaces you're tending. Can you fit in somewhere to hang laundry to dry? You know, solar and wind powered laundry drying is very efficient. Do you want to fit in a plant nursery bed where you can tuck seedlings until they go to their permanent homes? You know, for all those times when as gardeners we bring home a plant and we go, I'll find you a place, and then they slowly sit and die in the pot. Having a nursery bed is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. Or if you're moving seedlings from spots in your yard where you're like, you can't stay there, you can tuck them into the nursery bed until you're ready to pass them on to somebody else who needs more native plants. So plan this functional spaces before you plan out your planting plan so that you don't have conflicts later on. But once you've accounted for those existing conditions and practical considerations, it's time to start planning the planted areas. And much of what gives an impression of messy or weediness that concerns a lot of people when they're starting to plant native species is when lots of individual plants are assembled together, either without their plant community at all or drawn from a whole bunch of different plant communities, rather than grouped together in patches and alongside their evolutionary peers based on the conditions of the space. Clustering several plants of the same species together makes nectar and pollen gathering pollen foraging more efficient for bees and other pollinators, while also creating a more cohesive visual effect. The solution to avoiding the impression of weediness isn't to narrow the range of species that you can select from to only those that will tolerate unfamiliar neighbors or even no neighbors at all, but to start the plant selection process with an ecosystem in mind. Look to the ecosystem that most closely matches the conditions found in each of the planting areas you're working with. So start with an ecosystem in mind and then select from those plants. And you can find those ecosystem plant lists on the plant library page at my website. So I'm not just saying, okay, go research. There's actually a resource for that now. And then the easiest way to pull together a space that's both aesthetically and ecologically cohesive is to start with the plants that provide the fabric of the space. Frequently, grasses or sedges, these are often referred to as matrix species. And one of those links I shared in that email a couple of hours ago is an article on matrix planting that it includes a really good overview and some lovely photos. And if you're using the plant library as a starting point, you can either browse through the grasses list and grasses and sedges list and look for a species that suits the conditions you're working with, or you can browse through the list for whatever ecosystem type you've worked out with that you're working with to see which grasses or sedges are on that list. And plants naturally congregate in communities by height and growing preferences. So by working with their natures rather than against them, we can help to create spaces that are visually appealing because they're healthy and thriving. Choose the matrix species based on conditions first, and then select the flowering species for the different seasons. You'll find a list like this one on the screen at the bottom of each of the individual species profiles in the plant library, including the grasses. Don't forget to include goldenrods, asters, and milkweeds. There's quite a few species of each of these, and one or another will be suited to the conditions and ecosystem you're working with. Start with 1 to 3 blooming species for each season and plant them in loose masses. If the space allows, more species can be added, but try to fit at least 3 to 9 plants of each species to best support that effective foraging by the pollinators, and only add more plant species if you have room after you've put the quantities in. Larger spaces can accommodate patches of different matrix species to allow for variations in heights, creating sort of hills and islands in large open areas, or a height gradient against a wall or a fence. This mimics how heights tend to be distributed in natural ecosystems. If you're trying to create visual separation between spaces, so you want some screening, go to town with the tall grasses, shrubs, and perennials. But if you're trying to avoid a jungle feel, keep the eye level sightline open. So between about 3.5 feet high off the ground up to about 7 feet high. If you keep that space open, you will avoid the jungle feel while still having a lush feel. So if you've got trees or something above that, it gives you sort of foresty canopy savanna feel. If you are going for a low meadow or prairie feel, still sort of sticking to that 3-foot height range, it will create an open feeling if that's something that's important that you're going for. And there's lots of plants and ecosystem types that can accommodate that. If your goal is minimal tending in the long run, you might want to consider sticking to just a narrow range of heights for the perennials and grass layer so that you can leave them to self-seed where they like. So doesn't matter if they sort of pop up here and there, they're all going to blend in well together, and nobody's going to overwhelm anyone else because they're all sort of sharing the same height. They're not competing for light. But if you plant adjacent spaces with masses at different heights, you want to maintain those variations of high area and lower area, you will need to pull or transplant some self-seeded volunteers, especially if the taller species that self-seed into the lower areas now and then. It's not necessarily a problem if you like to gift native seedlings to anyone with space to plant them, but it is something to consider at the planting stage if your long-term goal is very low maintenance. And in most tall plant communities, including a ground cover layer, a species, or I should say most tall plant communities do include a ground cover layer, and that's species that fill in below and between the taller, wider species. And as I mentioned earlier, some shorter, earlier blooming species have evolved specifically to fill those niches, and I've labeled those as underplants in the plant library. You can, if you go to the ground cover tab, you can find, you'll see them in there. They're all flagged. They've got a border and a label on them to make them easy to pick out. Wild strawberry is a classic one for this space. So back to your actual plan. When I layer the ecosystem areas and the functional areas over each other, I end up with something that looks kind of like this. And some of the areas closer to the house are going to be set aside for walkable ground covers, the nursery bed area, some fruiting shrubs. So for the planting plan, I'll focus on the back of the yard. I started by selecting matrix species for each of the areas based on the conditions and the rough height that I had in mind. So for the dry meadow ecosystem area, I selected side oats grama, which is a shortish grass that doesn't mind summer heat and drought. For the meadow area near the fence at the side, I've selected switchgrass that will grow 4 to 5 feet tall because I'd like some height against that fence. For the shaded area at the back fence, I've selected a mix of hairy woodland brome and bottlebrush rye. The bottlebrush rye is really very striking. It's a very neat looking grass, but they do have a tendency to fade away after a few years. They're kind of an early succession species. So I included the second species, the woodland brome, to be sure that some tall grasses remain in that area over the long run. For the shaded area closer to the middle of the yard, I selected nodding fescue, which is also a forest grass, but it's one that just grows to around 2 feet tall. So it's an area suited to shorter species. And so working from the ecosystem companions list for each of these grasses, I selected a few flowering species for each area, looking for at least one spring, one summer, and one fall blooming species for each. I also selected an underplanting species for the 2 areas that will have tall plants to match the tall matrix species. And so I ended up with this plant list. And this is actually, if you're working with a few areas and you're trying to make sure that you have some spring and some summer and some fall, making a little bit of a grid like this, and this is the tidied version. The first one just started on a sheet of paper and then with a pen, and then I made it the clean version so you can actually see it. So you don't need anything special for doing those. So to place these on the plan, I start by placing the tallest species that I've selected for each area, clustering them or spreading them out based on sort of their size or their texture. So in a lot of cases, there isn't one perfect spot for them, but I do try to keep things like where I would be viewing the garden from in mind. Because diversity, ecosystem appropriateness, plant density, and approach to tending the space that doesn't restrict it from maturing and changing over time are all important for the health of the plant community. But the exact placement can be influenced by aesthetics as long as all those other things come first. I continue the plan by adding in the mid-height species, and then I add in the shortest species. And then I check the bloom season distribution by coloring in the spring species. And you can do this on tracing paper if you want to sort of keep each season separate and you're just doing this on graph paper and tracing paper. Then I take a look at the summer bloom distribution. and the fall bloom distribution. So I make sure I've got some for every season and a reasonable amount of blooming plants for each season to make sure that all the pollinators that have made their homes in my yard have something to eat all the way through the seasons. And once I have a layout that I'm happy with a good distribution of bloom seasons through the space, I fill in the planting grid with the maintenance or the matrix species and the underplanting species. So for perennials, grasses and sedges and other ground covers, I plant seedlings at roughly a 1 foot spacing, with the ground cover and matrix species filling in those spaces on that graph paper between where I've placed the flowering species. This might seem tight, but think of it like the difference between tree spacing in an old-fashioned orchard with those wide spaces between the trees and how a forest looks. Trees can spread to fill in a lot of space, but they can also cohabitate much more closely, perfectly well. Wider spacing also leaves more room for any annual seeds in the soil to germinate and potentially outcompete the new perennials, and tends to result in a less complete ecosystem with less habitat for the small critters that live their lives among the foliage. This step is actually where drawing your base plan and graph paper comes in really helpful, because you just fill in every square of the planting area. There we go. So while I prepare drawings on my computer for speed and for editability, you can follow these exact same processes with simple low-cost tools and very basic drawing ability, because unlike with those 3D drawings that I used to do, the point of this is not a pretty plan. It's a cohesive ecosystem space. So it doesn't matter if your drawing's not pretty. It's just that for keeping track of things, making your plant list and planting them on planting day, and then you're done. You don't need that. It's just a drawing. It's a very temporary thing, and it does not need to be anything special in and of itself. So tools wise, you can do this with graph paper, pencil, pen, markers, something to draw with, and tape measure for measuring out your space. And tracing paper is helpful for visualizing the different bloom seasons, but it's not entirely necessary. And same thing, colored pencils or crayons or markers or highlighters, etc. Whatever you have to draw with, it doesn't need to be fancy. And again, the colored pencils or markers are helpful, but not 100% required. You really just need graph paper, something to draw with, and tape measure. So the planning process steps, a quick recap. So you draw your base plan, putting it at 1 foot per square on standard graph paper works out really well. Map out any functional spaces or changes and any practical considerations. So things like height limitations for safe sight lines or around traffic. Identify the ecosystem type that you're working with, and that can vary in different parts of your yard, as I showed you in the example. Select the matrix, so those grass or sedge species for each area, and then select an initial 3 to 9 flowering species for each area, and build up from there as space allows. Select 1 or more ground cover species for below any tall species. Place them on the plan. I start with the tallest species in each area and add more species as the space allows until the planting plan is full. Try to reserve around 1/3 of the planting squares for the matrix species, or as much as 2/3 if you're looking toward a meadow or prairie ecosystem, or if you're working towards that. So probably one of the hardest things about this whole process is accepting that not all possible species can fit into most urban or suburban scale gardens. Ecological planting at the small scale, at the small scales that are possible for most gardeners, means planting and tending a small piece of an ecosystem, not an entire ecosystem in miniature. The pollinators need a certain amount of flowers to be able to efficiently feed. They need certain quantities. So putting just 1 plant of every species doesn't really serve them that well. So accept that you won't have room for all of the species in your space, and encourage your neighbors to plant the ones that just wouldn't fit. You know, make the wish list for when your neighbors say, well, that's kind of interesting. Be like, I have your plant list. All the ones that couldn't fit in my yard. So one last closing note. While shifting to an ecosystem-first approach to planting is sometimes framed as like a shocking change that most gardeners or communities aren't ready for, to me, it doesn't seem very different from the transition from the once predominantly annual gardens and home landscapes to the predominantly perennial home landscapes of today. When I was a child interested in gardening, local nurseries didn't stock much more than peonies and irises when it came to perennials, and only 2 or 3 colors of each of those. They didn't even have actual cultivar names. They were pink peony, white peony, red peony. Now there's hundreds of varieties of perennials available in nurseries every spring, even those seasonal pop-up nurseries. And the single sad rack of native species at most Loblaws locations each spring is quite reminiscent of the single rack of perennials at Canadian Tire Garden Centre 35 years ago when I bought my very first columbine. It's only been 20 years since the book Front Yard Gardens, Growing More Than Grass, that came out. It's by Liz Primo, and it's only been 20 years since that was published. And now Front Yard Covered with Gardens is often seen as ambitious, but otherwise rarely commented on as long as it's a conventional perennial garden. Highline Park in New York was revolutionary when it opened to the public in 2009. Now the naturalistic style is becoming increasingly common and widely accepted and praised. Adapting the best practices of these plant-dense spaces to urban and suburban yards and gardens is just the next step in the transition that's already well underway. It's not as revolutionary as some neighbors will make you think. You're not being revolutionary. You're actually just leading a trend that's already on the go. All right, so I am going to stop the screen share and go to the chat. Speaker view. So let's see what showed up in the chat and if people have questions. Okay. All right. So yes, I actually started from blank slate with your garden. Well, yes and no. That photo I showed of a backyard a while back, that was actually the backyard when I moved here. But that's when I moved here 12 years ago. And I have planted a lot of plants, and so I really started to switch to native species around 6 years ago. And so the space is actually gradually shifting, but I figured I'd use this space as an example because it's a space I'm familiar with. But no, I have not done the blank slate. Fully, yes. So I've been doing that sort of slow transition. Some of it has been pulling out and composting plants that I know are problematic. Some has been digging out and giving away species that are non-problematic but not native. And some it's just been sort of going, okay, well, we'll just plant a whole bunch of natives around you, and I know you're going to slowly fade because these ones are so much stronger. So yeah, it does sometimes mean digging up and sending away plants. Incredible. Yes, I do offer some design services for exactly this kind of thing, because I used to offer the really complete design, the sort of landscapey design services, and then I stopped for a couple of years, and now I'm going, okay, I will do this particular kind because I know it's a steep learning curve to learn all of the plants. The process is actually fairly straightforward, but I do know learning all the plants does take a while. I haven't planted thistles yet. I got asked if I ever plant thistles. I haven't yet, but it's definitely on my plan. I was just hoping I could find some local ones, and unfortunately I thought the seed library would have some, and then I wasn't able to get my hands on them in time. A question about ground covers for full sun and dry area. I'm actually going to show something on that. So the question of, if I can't acquire all the plants I'll need right away, should I start with fewer individuals of the full range of species spread around the whole area, or try to fill in a space at a time? I would do a space at a time, because also if you start to plant it as a healthy ecosystem, you're going to start to get a lot of seeds off of those, and then you can propagate out pretty quickly. Also, if you go to the plant swaps in the spring. The Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library's plant swap, if you're in Ottawa, there's a lot of plants there. Okay, so a question about what computer program I use. Because my background is in design, I already have like an AutoCAD type program. I use a cheaper version called DraftSite, but it's not free. And then I've been just doing the colorization in, there's a cheap, it is still by the same company, but there's a cheap version of Photoshop. It's just a really stripped down version called Photoshop Elements, and that's what I've been using to color them. I know AutoCAD has a steep learning curve. I don't. There probably is a program out there that could do graph sort of layouts really effectively. I just don't know what it is. So yeah, so I'm actually going to go. I've got a couple of questions. Not sure if they're all the same one from the ground covers. I'm actually going to quickly turn screen sharing back on and show you something. Because rather than me going, oh, this species or that species, let me just shut down these. Shut down one thing, and I'm going to bring up a website. So I made this fancy website, so I'm going to show how, because it's really good for answering questions. All right, so on my website, cultivatedart.com. I've got some things off of here so I can actually see everything. There's a plant library page. With that, there's a bunch of, there's over 200 species on here now, and I will keep adding to this over time, so it will continue to grow. Almost all of them are native to Ontario species. The exceptions all have a little bit of this little wavy dash at the front, and they're still North American species. They're just not historically native to Ontario, and there's only about a dozen of them on the whole site. But you can go to ground covers and look at the ground covers here. You can also, if you go, okay, but I want a ground cover for hot, dry site. Well, if you check a couple of them out, and you'll see that they are sort of average to dry soil. Well, then if you check the ecosystem species list below, or sorry, ecosystem companions for the species, these will all also be plants that will cohabitate quite well with those. So you can start to look through and go, okay, well, you mentioned you had in one question there, prairie smoke and wild strawberry. Well, these ones are also good. So you've got Pearly Everlasting, you've got Field Pussy Toes, Coreopsis is a little bit taller, but they like hot, dry spots as well. If you're looking for ground covers specifically though, when you want to just browse all the ground covers, you can go through the ground covers list, and these ones have different growing conditions, but ones that are mowable are actually noted in their description. So if you're looking for sort of walkable and mowable species, and that would include, they'll have a note about mowing a foot traffic tolerant, and this is one that is actually really, they grow at the edge of my rural driveway, and they get driven, they grow in each summer after the ground dries up enough that we're not putting ruts in it, and they get driven on. So, there you can find lots of ground cover options, and you can also browse by ecosystem. So if you're like, well, it's actually just a really dry area, well, go to the dry meadow species, which will tend to be mostly shorter species, although there's some exceptions. But these are all ones that tolerate very dry conditions. And you can kind of go through and look at any that are noted as ground covers or underplants. And pick from there. So it is meant to be a resource list that you can return to. All right, let me pull up the chat again. There's the chat. Need to make it bigger. All right, so just can't plant them all. Yes, I understand the frustration, just can't plant them all, because here's the other thing. I've explained how to plant sort of an ecosystem dense, non-jungly, sort of just ecologically low care space that will thrive. Well, I don't follow all those rules because I'm trying to grow all the species, and not just because I'm trying to grow all the species, but also because I do try to grow them for seeds. So I am trying to grow a lot of different species. Luckily, I have access to a few different spaces, so I can grow the species suited to those areas. I'm not just working with the urban yard, the one that I showed. That was wonderful talk, Rachel and Peter. All right, so that was just a thank you. Were there any other questions? Oh, and somebody noted they use Procreate on their iPad, which was like $12 and has layers you can turn on and off and has a grid for scale. So there you go. If you work on an iPad, you can get a $12 program to do exactly this. And that's sort of part of the point I do want to make, is that this doesn't need to have a high barrier of entry. You can work from resources like this, and some of the ones that I sent out in the earlier email, like this library, which is in that earlier email, to sort of work out which species are appropriate for your space, and then you can draw it out using really basic drawing skills, using really basic tools. I'm a big fan of converting spaces without hauling a lot of soil in and out, so there's a low cost there. You can get seeds for a lot of these. You can get seeds for a lot of these from the Wildflower Seed Library each fall, and into the winter. I do grow and sell a lot of perennials. I sell them as seedlings though, so they're $1.50 each, so that hopefully you can afford to put them in densely enough to actually have those dense ecosystems. So try to make this really accessible. Yes, this is recorded, and I will be adding it to the website. So on the website, there's a videos page. So videos. It's not here yet, obviously, because I'm still recording it, but it is going to be added to the video library page. So you will be able to go back, pause, replay from that sort of 30 minutes in and watch the step-by-step if you like. So the question about the formal design native plant garden, the problem with the formal design is you have to keep them that way. And so what I have found very much with plants over the years is you're not going to get everything in the right space the first time. But plants, if they're allowed to sort of sort themselves out and do a bit of self-seeding, and then somebody spreads a little bit here and somebody spreads a little bit there, and they're in community, as long as they're kind of close to being in the right spots, they will actually kind of sort themselves out as an ecosystem over time. And a formal garden doesn't allow for that. It also tends to require a certain amount of space between things, and that those spaces actually mean that the life that would normally be in the plant mass there doesn't have anywhere to live. So if you want to put a bunch of trees in a straight line and then plant a mixed meadow in and around under them, that's fine, that works. But if you're trying to keep it tidy, you're going to start to run into ecosystem conflicts, because that an awful lot of life lives on the untidiness and by breaking down and digesting the dead bits and all of those things. So that's where I sort of go, formal doesn't work as well unless you have large swaths and you can just sort of put some straight lines through otherwise large swath. Somebody asked, do I ship? No, I don't actually, because the plants actually go out without even any pots. They get taken out of their trays, out of their plug trays, laid out in rows and rolled up and sent home like a plant burrito, because they're going out with really minimal inputs. Okay, thank you. $1.50. Hey, if you're coming from somewhere, somebody commented $1.50 per plant, almost worth a drive to Ottawa. If you organize with a bunch of people and you come and drive into Ottawa and pick up a whole bunch at once, that can actually make sense. When do I sell it? Can we order ahead? So I have seeded under the plant library, because the plant library doubles as a store for about 8 weeks a year. It's the same place. And any that aren't marked with an asterisk have been seeded. And actually, I came across some old seeds that were from a year before. So a couple of things that are marked with an asterisk may actually end up being available, but I'll wait until the seeds actually germinate. But everything that doesn't have an asterisk, I have seeded. So because these are seedlings, like a lot of these are out winter sown, some of the worms ones I've just been sowing in the last couple of weeks. So I don't know quantities until they germinate. So I'll be sort of updating all my inventories through April and May. And then the store will open, I think it's May 12th or 13th. All right, so I'm not seeing more questions. Yeah, May 12th is the day the store will open. And there's a bit of info on here, so there's no surprises. Do I think it's too late to winter sow? Somebody just asked. I think you could still get away with the 30-day winter sows. Definitely not the 90s. You're kind of squeezing it on the 60-day ones, because winter sowing is an awful lot like, well, basically cold stratification that you can do in your fridge, and winter sowing work a lot of the same ways. And it's actually the time that they spend kind of cold and damp. And so you still have most of the kind of cold and damp left. Because that cold and damp just doesn't end as soon as things thaw. You might have your germination start a little bit later, but honestly, we still have nearly 60 days of cold and damp. So a lot of species, yeah, you go ahead. I would say, you know, get them out tomorrow. And the 30-day ones, you still got some flex. So yeah, go ahead and still, if you've got some seeds you haven't planted yet, go ahead and plant them. And some of them that will surprise you, actually, there's a culprit is right here in front of me. So yellow giant hyssop, it's supposed to be 60-day cold stratification. I was doing my winter seeding back in December, and I always try to really, really well hydrate the pots. So I put them in little pots, I water them really well. I put them in a pot tray with water so that they're really saturated, and then I put them into the little clamshell containers and put them outside, because I could fit several species into each clamshell container, because I'm selling over 200 species. So I need to do lots of small pots. But anyway, I started them, and then I got a little bit of a head cold, and so I just didn't get back to it for a couple of days. So they were just sitting in the dining room in the trays and ready to get put into the clamshell containers and put outside. In 3 days, the anise hyssop germinated. So never mind, they didn't get any cold stratification, and they germinated in 3 days from being sown. So sometimes they'll surprise you, and these poor things have had to limp by over the winter, slightly stunted in a tray under the lights. I just potted them up into the bigger container 2 days ago. So somebody's saying, I put 2 90-day cold strat seeds yesterday out and was thinking of bringing them back into the fridge when it gets too warm. Would that work? That would actually work. You can sort of get that extra month or so of cold. They might surprise you and start to germinate before you even bring them in. Because as I was saying about like the hyssop, no cold treatment, they came up in 3 days. The plants will surprise you sometimes. We try to figure out best practice, but also, and this is another reality of native plants and ones that are close to their wild state, is they're less predictable because they are more individual. There's more natural variation. So some of the resources I shared, somebody asked if there's similar native plant information available for other provinces, New Brunswick, for example. So the resources I shared other than this library are ones that are sort of national or continent based. Well, they don't usually extend into Mexico, but sort of Canada, US. But a website like this, well, it didn't even exist in Ontario until like a month and a half ago when I launched it. So right now, no, I'm not aware of one in New Brunswick, but there might be. I haven't looked. All right, any other questions before we wrap it up? Right, I'll wait for just a second, but I'm going to do one plug. I'm terrible about self-promotion on certain things, but anyway, I'm going to do a plug for this. If you like all these things that I talk about and this approach in relation of being like in relationship with land, and it all sounds lovely, but you're like, I don't want to be the weird one all on my own. And you like to hang out with a bunch of other people who are equally interested in doing these things, this sort of weird approach, and also just have a space to practice before you have to practice on your own yard. I do teach a course. It's in person here in Ottawa, and it starts in May, and we meet every 2 weeks from, I should actually say May to October, because it starts right at the start of May this year. Meet every 2 weeks. So there's sort of 11 gatherings, and it's either a daytime or an evening one. It's every second Thursday, and we work on projects. And so I take you through baking beds and planting out annuals for bed prep, and then growing some food ones, but also planting native plants and working with existing materials, and just all these really practical, how do we have not a low impact, but a low harm, high helping relationship with land and ecosystems. So I do teach that course, and if you're like, hey, I'd like to actually practice some of this weird stuff, then hang out with other people who are also interested in this weird stuff. I do offer that course, and I would invite you to check it out. It's under the Learning Land Care tab on my website. All right. So thanks everyone for coming, and sorry about the technical things yesterday. Facebook Live did not work out the way I hoped it would, but looks like Zoom came to the rescue today, and lots of people came back. Yes, I do hope to offer the course every year. I did it last year, so doing it this year, and hopefully we'll be doing it again next year. All right. Great. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. It's an end meeting here around here somewhere. There.